The stranger's fever broke at dawn, but Clementine wished it hadn't. When his eyes opened, they weren't the confused, grateful gaze of a man who'd nearly died. They were steady, knowing, as if he'd been awake all night watching her move around the cabin, as if he'd been waiting for this exact moment. She'd spent the dark hours pacing, unable to sleep, her mind circling the impossibilities. The locket with Thomas's initials, her dead husband's initials, felt like it was burning a hole in her pocket. She'd taken it from Sterling's coat while he was unconscious, telling herself she needed to search for identification, but the moment her fingers touched the cold metal, she knew this wasn't coincidence. Sterling sat up slowly, his movements deliberate, despite his supposed weakness. His eyes found hers immediately, and she saw something there that made her step backward. Recognition, not the gradual recognition of someone trying to place a face, but the instant recognition of someone who already knew exactly who she was. "You're Clementine Ross," he said. And it wasn't a question. The sound of her real name, not the false name she'd given to travelers for 3 years, hit her like a physical blow. Her throat tightened. Only Thomas had called her that. Only Thomas had known that name belonged to her. "How do you?" she started, but Sterling was already reaching into his shirt. He pulled out a folded piece of paper, yellowed and worn, as if it had been carried for years. Her hands trembled as she took it, because even before she unfolded it, she recognized her own handwriting. It was a letter she'd written to Thomas the day before he died, telling him about her dreams of leaving the mountain, of finding a place where they could start fresh. A letter she'd never sent because he died before she could give it to him. A letter that should have been buried with him. But here it was, in a stranger's possession, with one line circled in faded ink. "Sometimes I think I'm meant to be alone forever. That happiness isn't meant for women like me." Clementine's vision blurred. This was in his coffin. "I put it there myself." Sterling's expression didn't change. "Thomas asked me to find you." The words hung in the air like smoke. Thomas had been dead for 3 years. 3 years of silence, of cold, of believing she would never feel anything again. And now this man was sitting in her cabin, claiming her dead husband had sent him. "That's impossible," she whispered. But even as she said it, she was remembering the way Sterling had whispered her name in his fever, the way his footprints had led away from her cabin, not toward it. Sterling leaned forward, his eyes never leaving hers. "He told me you'd say that." Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows like something was trying to get in. Or maybe, Clementine thought with growing terror, something was trying to get out. Clementine's hand shook as she clutched the letter, but not from cold. Thomas had been her secret, the only person who'd known about her dreams, her fears, her real name. They'd lived isolated on this mountain precisely because she'd been running from something. And Thomas had protected that secret until his dying breath. "You're lying," she said, but her voice cracked on the words, because Sterling knew things that were impossible to know. Sterling stood slowly, and despite his supposed weakness, he moved with the confidence of a man who belonged in her space. He walked to the mantel where she kept Thomas's things, his pipe, his worn Bible, a small wooden carving he'd made of a bird. Sterling picked up the carving without hesitation, turning it over in his hands like he'd held it before. "He made this the week before he died," Sterling said quietly. "Told me it was for you. Said you loved watching the birds migrate south every winter, that you envied their freedom to leave." The room spun. She'd never told anyone about the birds. It had been her private sorrow, watching them fly away each year while she remained trapped in her grief, in her isolation, in her fear of the life she'd left behind. "Thomas talked about you constantly," Sterling continued, setting the carving down gently. "Said you were stronger than you believed. Said you blamed yourself for things that weren't your fault." "Stop." The word came out as a whisper, because he was right. She did blame herself for Thomas's death, for the life she'd been forced to flee, for the choices that had led them to this mountain where he died alone while she was in town getting supplies. Sterling stepped closer, and she could smell something on him. Not just the pine and snow she'd expected, but something warmer, something familiar. The same soap Thomas used to use, the same tobacco from his pipe. Since that should have been impossible, because Thomas had been dead for 3 years. "He was worried about you," Sterling said, his voice softer now. "Said you'd lock yourself away. Said you'd forgotten how to live." Clementine looked up at him, really looked, and for a moment she saw something that made her breath catch. The way Sterling held his left shoulder slightly higher than his right, exactly like Thomas did after he'd injured it in a fall. The way his fingers drummed against his leg when he was thinking. The same rhythm Thomas used to tap out. "Who are you?" she breathed. Sterling reached out slowly, as if approaching a wounded animal, and touched her face. His hand was warm, impossibly warm, and for the first time in 3 years, she felt herself lean into human touch. "I'm the man Thomas sent to bring you back to life," he said. But as his thumb traced along her cheekbone, Clementine noticed something that made her blood turn to ice. On his ring finger was a thin band of pale skin, the exact width and placement of a wedding ring recently removed. Clementine jerked away from his touch, her heart hammering against her ribs. The pale band on his finger felt like evidence of a crime she didn't understand yet. "You were married." Sterling's hand dropped to his side, but he didn't deny it. Instead, he looked at the wedding ring mark with something that might have been grief or guilt. "I was." What happened to her? Clementine's voice was barely a whisper because suddenly she was terrified of the answer. Everything about this man felt wrong and right at the same time, like a beautiful song played in a minor key. "She died," Sterling said, and the words carried a weight that made the air in the cabin feel heavier. 3 years ago. 3 years. The same time Thomas had died. Clementine felt something cold creep up her spine that had nothing to do with the mountain air seeping through the cabin walls. How? Sterling moved to the window, staring out at the snow-covered peaks where she'd found him. She was, he taken from me, by someone who should have protected her. The way he said it made Clementine think of her own secrets, her own reasons for running to this mountain with Thomas. They'd fled something, too. Someone who should have protected her, but had become the very thing she needed to escape from. "Thomas told me about your father," Sterling said without turning around. And Clementine's world tilted sideways. Her father, the man whose name she'd spent years trying to forget. The reason she'd changed her name, the reason she'd hidden on this mountain, the reason Thomas had died protecting her from a past that had finally caught up with him. Thomas promised me something before he died, Sterling continued, his breath fogging the glass. He made me swear an oath. What kind of oath? But even as she asked, Clementine was backing toward the door, because she was starting to understand that Sterling hadn't stumbled into her life by accident. He'd been sent, and if Thomas had sent him, it meant her dead husband had known something was coming. Sterling turned from the window, and in the morning light streaming through the glass, she could see something in his face that made her pulse race. Determination, purpose, and underneath it all, something that looked like longing. He made me promise to keep you safe, Sterling said, no matter what it cost. Safe from what? Sterling's eyes met hers across the small cabin, and she saw him make some internal decision from the men who killed him. The words hit her like a physical blow. Killed. Not died of fever, like she'd always believed. Not died of the lung sickness that had been slowly consuming him. Killed. That's impossible. She breathed. Thomas died in his sleep. I was there. I watched. You watched him die from poison, Sterling said quietly. Poison meant for you. Outside, the sound of horses broke the morning silence. Multiple horses moving fast up the mountain trail. Sterling's head snapped toward the sound, his hand instinctively moving to his coat, where she now realized he carried a concealed weapon. They found us, he said, and suddenly he wasn't the weak, fevered man she'd saved. He was something else entirely, something dangerous. Who found us? Clementine asked, but she already knew. The same men who'd forced her to flee years ago had finally tracked her down. The sound of approaching horses grew louder, their hooves pounding against the frozen ground like a countdown to something terrible. Sterling moved with sudden urgency, grabbing Clementine's coat from its peg and pressing it into her hands. How many men are we talking about? Clementine asked, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. After 3 years of hiding, she'd almost convinced herself the danger was over, that her father's reach couldn't extend this far into the wilderness. 4, maybe 5, Sterling said, checking his weapon with practiced efficiency. Enough to finish what they started. Clementine's mind raced. You knew they were coming. That's why you're really here. Sterling paused in his preparations, his eyes finding hers. Thomas didn't just send me to keep you safe. He sent me because he knew they'd never stop hunting you. And he knew that when they came, you'd need someone who understood what they took from you. What do you mean? Instead of answering, Sterling reached into his coat and pulled out something that made Clementine's breath catch. A small silver locket, not the one with Thomas's initials, but another one, older, more tarnished. With trembling fingers, she took it and opened it. Inside was a miniature portrait of a woman with dark hair and kind eyes. A woman who looked exactly like Clementine, but younger, more innocent. On the opposite side was an inscription, My beloved Emma, forever yours, S.M. Emma was my wife, Sterling said quietly. Your father's men killed her because she tried to help another woman escape, a woman whose story sounded very much like yours. The pieces clicked together with horrible clarity. Sterling wasn't just some stranger Thomas had sent. He was a man who'd lost everything to the same evil that had destroyed her life. A man who understood her pain because he'd lived it. "They've been hunting women like us for years," she whispered, "women who tried to escape. Your father doesn't forgive betrayal." Sterling said, "And he doesn't forget." The horses were close now, close enough that she could hear voices calling out in the cold morning air. Men's voices, rough and confident, the voices of people who'd never doubted their right to take whatever they wanted. Sterling moved to the back wall of the cabin and began pushing aside a heavy wooden cabinet. Behind it was a door she'd never noticed, barely visible in the rough-hewn logs. "Thomas built this for you," Sterling explained, "an escape route. He always knew this day might come." Clementine stared at the hidden door, understanding flooding through her. All those times Thomas had worked on the cabin repairs. All those nights he'd stayed up late, claiming he couldn't sleep. He'd been preparing for war. "He loved you enough to plan for the worst," Sterling said, his voice rough with emotion, "and he trusted me enough to see it through." As she looked at Sterling, really looked at him, she saw something that made her chest tighten. The way he watched her wasn't just protective, it was tender. Despite the danger, despite the impossibility of their situation, something real was growing between them. "Come with me," she said suddenly. "We'll run together, find somewhere they can't reach us." Sterling's expression shifted, pain flickering across his features. "Clementine, I know it's crazy. I know we barely know each other, but Thomas trusted you, and that means something, and She faltered, surprised by her own words. "I don't want to lose anyone else." For a moment, Sterling looked like he might say yes, like he might take her hand and run toward whatever uncertain future waited beyond these mountains. But then the voices outside grew louder, and she heard something that chilled her blood. Her father's voice, not one of his men, but him personally, calling her childhood name into the morning air. He came himself. She breathed. Sterling's face went hard as stone. That changes everything. The sound of her father's voice calling her childhood name. "Clara, my sweet Clara," made Clementine's legs nearly give out. She hadn't heard that voice in 5 years. Not since the night she'd fled with Thomas. The night she discovered what her father was truly capable of. Sterling caught her arm as she swayed, his touch steady and warm. "He doesn't get to have you," he said fiercely, "not after what he did." "You don't understand," Clementine whispered. "He's not just my father. She struggled to find words for something so monstrous. "He owns half the territory. Judges, lawmen, politicians, they all answer to him, and the women who cross him." She shuddered. "They disappear." Sterling's grip tightened. Emma tried to testify against him. She'd helped 3 women escape his businesses. The night before the trial, they came for her businesses. The word was too clean for what her father did. The forced marriages. The women sold like cattle. The daughters trapped in golden cages until they learned to be grateful for their chains. Clementine had been destined for the same fate until Thomas had shown her another way. Clara. Her father's voice was closer now, honeyed with false affection. "I know you're in there, sweetheart. Daddy's come to take you home." "Home?" The word twisted in her stomach like a knife. That mansion had never been home. It had been a beautiful prison where she'd learned to smile while dying inside. Sterling moved to the hidden door, pressing his hand against her back. "Thomas made me promise something else," he said quietly. "If running wasn't possible, if they cornered us," he met her eyes, "he made me promise to make sure you never went back alive." The words should have terrified her. Instead, they filled her with a strange peace. Thomas had understood. Even in death, he was still protecting her from a fate worse than dying. "But I have another idea," Sterling continued, his voice dropping to barely a whisper. "Something Thomas didn't plan for." "What?" Sterling's hand found hers, their fingers intertwining with an intimacy that felt both foreign and familiar. "I've been hunting your father for 3 years, learning his patterns, his weaknesses. I know how to hurt him. It's impossible. He's too powerful, too connected. Not anymore." Sterling's eyes blazed with something that might have been hope or vengeance or both. 3 days ago, a federal marshal was murdered in Denver, a good man who'd been investigating your father's operations. That murder was a mistake because now Washington is paying attention. Outside, she heard horses spreading out around a cabin. Her father was positioning his men, cutting off escape routes. The net was tightening. "There's a wire waiting at the telegraph office in Millbrook," Sterling continued urgently. "Evidence Emma gathered before she died. Names, dates, records of everything your father's done. But someone has to survive long enough to send it." Clementine felt something shift inside her chest. For 3 years, she'd lived in fear, hiding like a wounded animal. But Sterling was offering her something she'd never dared dream of, the chance to fight back. "Clara," her father's voice was right outside now, "I'm losing patience, sweetheart. And you know how unpleasant Daddy gets when he's angry." Sterling squeezed her hand. "What's it going to be? Run and hide for the rest of our lives, or end this once and for all?" As if in answer to his question, something crashed against the front door. They were out of time for running, but looking into Sterling's eyes, Clementine realized she didn't want to run anymore. The front door splintered under another blow, and Clementine made her choice. She squeezed Sterling's hand and said the words that would change everything. "I'm done running." Something fierce and proud flashed in Sterling's eyes. Thomas said, "You were the strongest woman he'd ever known." He was right. The door gave way with a crash, and her father's voice filled the cabin like poison in the air. "Now, Clara, there's no need for dramatics. You've had your little adventure. Time to come home and be the daughter I raised you to be." Clementine pressed herself against the wall beside the hidden door, Sterling positioned opposite her. Through the gap in the main room, she could see her father's silhouette, still tall and imposing despite his age, still wearing the expensive clothes that marked him as a man of importance. But now she could see what she'd been too young to understand before, the coldness in his stance, the way he held himself like he owned everything and everyone around him. "I know you're listening, sweetheart," her father continued, his voice sickeningly gentle. "And I know Thomas filled your head with foolish ideas about independence and choice, but Thomas is dead now, and it's time to accept reality." Sterling's jaw tightened at the casual mention of Thomas's murder, his hand moving to his weapon. But Clementine caught his eye and shook her head slightly. "Not yet." "I brought someone to see you," her father said, and Clementine heard footsteps, multiple sets of footsteps, including one that sounded different, hesitant, reluctant. "Tell her Judge Morrison," her father commanded. A voice Clementine recognized. The territorial judge, who'd been a frequent dinner guest at her father's table, spoke with obvious reluctance. "CL, your father has convinced me to issue a warrant for your arrest. Conspiracy to commit fraud, theft of family property. Unless you return voluntarily, I'll have no choice but to order your capture." The words were meaningless legal theater, but Clementine understood the real message. Her father had leverage over the judge, probably blackmail, possibly threats to the man's family, another innocent person trapped in her father's web. "You see, Clara," her father said, satisfaction warm in his voice. "There's nowhere to run, no one to help you. Even if you had found some fool man willing to protect you, what could one person do against the full weight of the law?" Sterling met her eyes across the small space, and something passed between them, an understanding, a shared recognition of what they were about to risk, because her father was wrong about one thing. Sterling wasn't just any fool man. He was a man who'd spent 3 years preparing for this exact moment. "However," her father continued, his voice taking on the tone he'd always used when offering his version of mercy, "I'm prepared to be forgiving. Come out now, and I'll forget about your little rebellion. You can even bring your companion. I'm sure I can find some use for him." The threat was clear. Her father wouldn't just kill Sterling. He'd make him suffer first. Make him an example. Add another name to the long list of people who'd paid the price for crossing him. Clementine looked at Sterling and saw her own determination reflected in his face. They both understood what success would cost and what failure would mean. But for the first time in 3 years, she wasn't afraid. "There's something else," Sterling whispered so quietly, she almost missed it. "Something I haven't told you about Emma." "What?" His eyes were steady on hers, full of a pain that matched her own. "She was pregnant when they killed her." The words hit Clementine like a physical blow. Emma hadn't just been Sterling's wife. She'd been carrying his child, a child who died because she'd tried to help women like Clementine escape. "I'm sorry," she breathed. "Don't be sorry," Sterling said fiercely. "Help me make it mean something." Outside, her father's patience was wearing thin. "Clara, you have 30 seconds to walk through that door, or I start burning down the cabin with you in it." Sterling counted down the seconds in his head as he reached into his coat and pulled out something Clementine hadn't expected, a small leather journal wrapped in oiled cloth. Emma's evidence, the real weapon in this fight. 10 seconds, Clara," her father shouted. "Judge Morrison," Sterling called out suddenly, his voice carrying clearly through the cabin. "Are you familiar with the murder of Federal Marshal Davidson in Denver 3 days ago?" Silence fell outside. Then her father's voice, sharp with alarm. "Who is that? Clara, who's in there with you?" Sterling stepped toward the main room, still partially concealed, but close enough to be heard clearly. "My name is Sterling Maddox, Deputy Federal Marshal, Western District, and I have a warrant for your arrest. Montgomery Ross." Clementine felt the world tilt. Deputy Federal Marshal. Sterling wasn't just a grieving widower seeking revenge. He was law enforcement. Official law enforcement with the authority to bring her father down. "That's impossible," her father snarled. "I know every marshal in the territory. You knew the ones you could buy or threaten." Sterling replied calmly, "But Marshal Davidson was bringing in outside help before he died. Marshals you'd never heard of. Marshals with evidence you thought was destroyed." Sterling held up Emma's journal. "Emma Maddox wasn't just my wife, Judge Morrison. She was also a federal informant. Everything she gathered before her murder is documented here. Names, dates, financial records, including evidence of your involvement, Judge." Clementine heard the judge make a sound of distress. "Montgomery, you said there were no records." "Shut up," her father snapped. But the damage was done. The judge's words were as good as a confession. Judge Morrison Sterling continued, "You have a choice. You can continue following Montgomery Ross's orders and face federal charges as an accomplice, or you can start telling the truth about the bribes, the false warrants, the cover-ups. I never wanted," the judge stammered. "I know," Sterling said, and his voice was surprisingly gentle. "He has something on you. Maybe your family, maybe your own secrets, but this is your chance to break free." Clementine watched Sterling work and felt something powerful unfold in her chest. This was why Thomas had trusted him, not just because he was strong or brave, but because he understood justice in a way that went beyond revenge. "You have 30 seconds to surrender, Ross," Sterling called out. "My backup is already on the way. 3 federal marshals riding hard from Millbrook. They'll be here within the hour." Her father's laugh was harsh and desperate. "You're bluffing. No one's coming." "Then why did you bring the judge?" Sterling asked quietly. "You only brought him because you knew this might go badly, because you suspected someone might be waiting for you here." Another silence. Longer this time. Clementine could practically hear her father's mind working, calculating odds, looking for escape routes. "All right," her father said finally, his voice taking on a reasonable tone that Clementine recognized and feared. It was the voice he used when he was about to do something terrible. "Let's discuss this like civilized people. Clara, come out where I can see you. We'll talk." Sterling shook his head at her urgently, but Clementine was already moving because she knew something about her father that Sterling didn't. When Montgomery Ross started talking about being civilized, someone was about to die. She stepped into the main room just as her father raised his gun, not toward the hidden door where Sterling was concealed, but toward Judge Morrison. "If I can't have my daughter," her father said with cold finality, "then I'll make sure no one can testify against me." The gunshot shattered the morning air, but it wasn't Judge Morrison who fell. Sterling had moved the instant Clementine stepped into view, launching himself from the hidden door as her father's attention fixed on his target. The 2 men crashed to the ground in a tangle of limbs and fury, her father's shot going wide. "Run, Morrison!" Clementine shouted to the judge, who stood frozen in terror. "Get to town. Tell them what you saw." The judge needed no further encouragement. He stumbled toward his horse and rode away like the devil himself was chasing him, which Clementine reflected wasn't far from the truth. Her father's remaining men hesitated, uncertain whether to help their employer or flee with the judge. That hesitation cost them. Sterling had trained for this moment for 3 years, and it showed. Within moments, Her father was disarmed and pinned. Sterling's gun pressed firmly against his temple. "It's over, Ross," Sterling said, breathing hard but steady. "Your men are gone. The judge is talking, and the evidence is already on its way to federal authorities." Her father looked up at Clementine, and she saw something she'd never seen before in his eyes. Fear, not just of death, but of failure, of losing control. "Clara," he said, his voice taking on that familiar manipulative tone, "you're my daughter, my blood. You can't let them destroy your own family?" For a moment, Clementine felt the old pull of guilt and obligation, the voice that had controlled her for so many years, that had made her believe she owed him something simply for being born. But then she thought of Thomas dying from poison meant for her, of Emma and her unborn child, murdered for trying to help others escape, of all the women who disappeared rather than submit to her father's will. "You're not my family," she said quietly. "You never were. Family doesn't buy and sell people. Family doesn't murder innocent women. Family doesn't poison their own daughters when they try to leave." Her father's face twisted with rage. "You ungrateful. The only family I had was Thomas," she continued, her voice growing stronger. "And now I have Sterling." Sterling looked up at her, his eyes soft, despite the gun in his hand and the dangerous man beneath him. "Clementine, I know it's fast," she said, heat rising on her cheeks. "I know we barely know each other, but Thomas trusted you with my life, and I trust Thomas. And what I feel when I look at you," she took a shaky breath, "I haven't felt alive in 3 years. You changed that." Sterling's hand found hers, warm and steady. "Emma told me once that love isn't about time, it's about recognition, about seeing someone and knowing they're meant to be part of your story." "How touching!" Her father sneered. "But you're both fools if you think this ends here. I have friends, connections," had Sterling corrected. Past tense. Judge Morrison's testimony will destroy those connections, and Emma's evidence will make sure you never hurt another woman. 6 months later, Clementine stood in the garden behind their new home in Colorado, watching Sterling split wood for the winter. Her father was serving life in federal prison. His empire dismantled, his victims finally free to speak their truth. Judge Morrison had received clemency in exchange for his cooperation and had become an unexpected ally in their fight for justice. Sterling straightened, wiping sweat from his brow, and caught her watching him. The smile that spread across his face was pure sunshine, warming her from the inside out. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, crossing to where she stood. "Thomas," she said honestly. "How he somehow knew exactly what I needed, even after he was gone." Sterling wrapped his arms around her from behind, and she leaned into his warmth. "He knew you deserved to be happy." "We both do," she said, turning in his arms. "After everything we lost, everything we survived, we deserve this." Sterling kissed her forehead, then her lips soft and sweet in the fading afternoon light. "Mrs. Maddox," he murmured against her mouth, and she still felt a thrill at hearing her new name. "I love you," she whispered, the words as natural as breathing now. "I love you too," he replied, "forever and always." As the sun set behind the mountains, Clementine Ross, now Clementine Maddox, finally understood what home truly meant. Not a place, but a person. Not safety imposed by walls and locks, but safety chosen freely with someone who saw her strength and cherished her heart. Thomas had been right to send Sterling to her, not just to save her life, but to teach her how to live it. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale where destiny and courage collide in ways you never expected. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.